Okay, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to start building out our models and getting our hands dirty in DBT. I know you've been waiting a long time for this. So the first thing we're going to do, like we said, we're trying to set up our project to match our target here, what we want to see. So the first thing we'll do is let's create some folders. Let's create the ones that we want. We know we want a staging schema. We're going to want that within our database. We're going to want we'll call it a warehouse, call this data warehouse, core, whatever you want. And then we'll create one more called reporting. One final thing that you might see is kind of separating the staging from everything else. Like we mentioned, staging is essentially a representation of the raw, and then everything else is delivered on top of that. So we can add one more layer here. Remember, directories are, they're free here, they're cheap, and there's a lot of great flexibility with this. Let's create a folder called marts. And what we're going to do is move reporting and warehouse into marts. So then we have marts and staging. And what we'll do for staging, we're going to create a new directory for each schema. So within here, we'll create a new folder, one for Avengers and one for Fandango. And we have these sources for each that we just made. So let's go ahead and move these let's move it to each one accordingly. So we have our sources for each. Now imagine, in this case, we have two sources, but in a real environment, you may have many different sources. And by kind of staging them and grouping them this way, you can consolidate and organize your project to match what you have in your data lake or your data landing zone. And there's no cost for an extra file or an extra folder, so use them. So let's create our first model, new file, and remember the naming convention. So we'll do stg underscore Avengers, 2 underscores, and then we're going to create the name of this source table here. So Avengers history.sql. This could get really long, and so maybe you need to shorten it or do something for your own if you have some crazy source names. But the nice thing is you look at this, you already know exactly this model is going to represent one-to-one with this source with just some basic renamings. But what we'll do just to start is we'll just do a select all from, and we'll use that source Jinja again. Again, I just want to see us get something in here and then we'll format it. So the 2 brackets, give yourself some space, source, parentheses, and then there's 2 different arguments here or parameters. Take a look at this. We have, we actually put these in the wrong one. Let me switch that. If we look at Avengers, so Avengers history. I just want to make sure I copy this. So the name of the source is Avengers and the name of the table, Avengers history. Okay. So now let's see what happens when we try to deploy this. What's going to happen here? So we'll do a new command. This is going to be new. And this is the command to actually run and deploy something to a database through DBT. And that's DBT run. And if you do just DBT run, what it's going to do is look at your project and run every single model. In this case, we only have one model, and it's going to know that because of the .SQL here under models, because we've configured it models here, DBT run. And there we can see it ran. And what we look at here, if we look at what happened, first we can see it's giving us this warning. That's because of this in here, and we'll fix that shortly. But if we look at this here, it says it's found one model, and that is this model right here. It's the only one we have. It's the only SQL file. It also has 0 tests, snapshots. We see it has 179 macros, and the only reason it's showing this many is because that's the default built-in. There's a lot of stuff built in to the DBT core when you initially install it behind the scenes. You can edit all of that however much you want, but it picks it up here. So that's, even though we haven't made it, it's the default ones. And we can see it deployed to public staging Avengers here. There's no database, but it's the default database that we made in our profile. So we would expect, without looking at this, that it would have created a view in Analytics Dev public with this name. And I'll say also that the default operation of DBT, if you change nothing, is to create views, and that's to avoid adding data to your database, doubling it up when you don't need it. And I'd say in general, the staging layer, it's a good idea to consider doing all of those as views, because you're really just trying to overlay on top of your sources. You don't need to double up that data necessarily. It may make sense for you performance wise, but a lot of times you just need a view on top of it, and then everything later will be a table. It's just a cleaned up version of your table. Okay, so let's take a look in here. I'm going to refresh just to be safe. Look at public, and here it is. We can see this table exists here, and we can let's preview this, and here it is. So this is the representative of, and we can look at the SQL. We can see it's dbt compiled and deployed this to our database here. dbt again is not itself holding any data. It's compiling your scripts and then sending it off to your database server to run. So it sent this script to Snowflake and ran it here for us. Okay, so while we're at it, just to get rid of this error, let's adjust this. We have dbt. Remember, this is our project level. We have models, the name of our project. We no longer have this examples directory, but what we do have is marts, staging, and then some subdirectories. Let's start with staging because it's the first one we're working on. Staging, and what this is going to say is anything within the staging directory, so anything within here, unless you explicitly override it, is going to have this materialization. And materialized in the dbt world is another way of saying, how is it going to build? Do you want it to build as a table, a view, something custom that you build? This is how we're describing it. It ships out of the box with certain things that we'll touch on a little bit more later. Ultimately, we're going to add marts here a little bit later. So we'll keep this as is, just to get rid of that issue. Now going back to this here. A good practice here is, even though it may seem redundant and we could just do a select all, like we said, this is a representation of your source. You want to rename things, make sure everything looks the way you want going forward in your project. This is really the gatekeeper. It's that first layer. So what I would recommend, we're going to select every column from this. Now, I've worked on projects where there's hundreds, even thousands of columns. And sometimes, you have to make an exception and you have to work around that. But for the most part, you want to select each column. You set it once and then that's it. And you're just tweaking. Remember, we're building for maintenance. I'll copy and paste this in here and I'll have this available for you so it's faster. So here is all of the columns listed out for this particular source. We have all of them here. And we can see some of this, maybe isn't how we would want to have it in the long run. We have name alias, we have this underscore here. You could work with that, but we want it to be more explicit and something that for the rest of the project, we don't need to rename it. We're going to name it how it should be named for the organization. And then maintenance is much easier. If we ever need to change it again, we just change it here. So here's a few things that we could add. One, we want to add a custom ID. So maybe we do MD5 URL as Avenger ID. And I'll say, you'll see here, I do all lowercase. This has become a habit. It's something I see a lot in the dbt community, doing everything underscore. Not a requirement. I think it's cleaner. You kind of get in the habit of it, but you'll see me do this. And no matter what you do, just be consistent because you want it to be clean and easy to read. Same with indentations here. So I'm actually going to clean this up. Okay, so I just finished going through and renaming and adding some subtle transforms here. Just to review, one, we renamed a few of these, and I even added some subtle logic statements here. So for example, if this column is null, default it to NA. So we can do that right here, and it's just going to take care of that for us. We don't need to do it later. We are saying current is yes as is current, and that's essentially saying if this is yes, it's true, otherwise false. It's a way of doing a Boolean in Snowflake. Init cap gender, so we're saying we want the first letter of this gender column to be capitalized always, so it's clean. If we look at here, it's lowercase. So here we see current is yes. We want that to be a true or false column instead of a yes. We're converting year to an integer so that it's specifically an integer value, maybe instead of a string, and we're renaming it. Stuff like this, giving it some better naming. So let's go ahead and save that and try to run this again. So we'll do a dbt run. Another thing to point out is we can see target is dev. So, we learned what that means a little earlier. Now, if we go back here, let's refresh and preview this. it's starting to look a little bit cleaner now. So we have all these are first capitalized, false. We've given an ID, and this is dev data. So this is a shortened list. There actually is more in the true raw database. This one only has 9 records, but you get the idea of kind of what this is all about. Now, another thing to point out here, a DBT convention that you'll see a lot is using CTEs, and that stands for Common Table Expression. And this is very popular in this, and there's a lot of research behind it. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining why this is beneficial. There's an entire article that I'll link that you can research about it. But basically, this is incorporating something that you see a lot in Python or software development, which is the idea of an import. So when you make a file, let's say in Python, you can import different other modules or projects, and right at the top, you can see exactly what it is, and you know, okay, this file includes these modules. And the same can now be true in DBT. And there's research that shows that if you use a CTE, even if you do a select star, it's actually treated as a pass-through, and it won't truly select all of those columns. The query engines are smart enough to only look at what you finally are selecting at the very end. To make a CTE, you start with, and then you give your CTE a name. So in this case, we'll call this Avengers History as, and then in here, we can do select all from the source. So think of this like an import. We're saying we're bringing in, we will be referencing this table, this source at some point, comma. And now to finish off your query, what you can do is a final CTE. Again, this might seem a little weird at first, and it is something that will add, the more you do it, you kind of get used to it. But it's a pretty standard DBT convention at this point. As, and then you have your final select. So in this case, this is our final select. So let's move this within, we'll move this within here, indent it so we have good clean spacing, and we'll finish off with a select all from final. Now, this might seem redundant right now because it's such a small query, and you can make that case. But the idea here is when you have a lot of different CTEs and you have a lot of transforms and stuff, later on, when you do go to troubleshoot, you can very quickly change what you're looking at by just switching up the final select. So you can kind of figure out, troubleshoot where the problem is, and you don't have to worry about all of them. You just handle it at the end. So that's one. And two, it just helps you organize yourself. It keeps you in a consistent order. So all of your models, all of your queries look the same, and you have a consistent flow and structure. And the last thing we'll do here is, because we're bringing it in here, we can replace this with this because it'll reference this here. And that's another benefit of these CTEs, because it allows you to name this data set however you plan on actually joining it later. So your joins are much cleaner. You don't need to do a lot of aliases. You don't have these long Jinja functions all over the place. It just, again, it just keeps it clean. And I'd say this look right here is a pretty standard DBT model look. We'll save this, give it one more run to make sure we're all good. And once we have this one set and ready to run, we'll go through and we'll make the other models quickly and start moving on from there. Okay, so this is all set. Now when this ran, just to see what this looks like, again, we have this target directory, and target now gives us two different options over here. We have compiled, which is just the basics, just the select of what we did. So we can see it, again, it transformed the source into a fully qualified statement. But if we look under run, run is going to give it everything wrapped in the create or replace. So this is truly right here what is being sent to Snowflake or whatever database server, and it's running this statement. So every single time you run this, it's going to create or replace it. So that way you can rerun it many times, and it's either going to create it if it's there, or it's going to replace it with the latest version, and you're all good. So, okay, let's go through and quickly build the rest of the staging models now that we know kind of how this is working. So we're good with Avengers. Let's create two more for Fandango here. We have STG _ Fandango score comparison. I'll just copy and paste this in here from what I have. So here we can see similar layout here. We're bringing in our source. This one happens to have quotes around it, but ultimately we are renaming it in a way that is consistent. Underscore with the spacing, all things are the same. One more. Scrape. This is the other file. And we're going to have this one look like this. So again, we have a CTE bringing in that source, a final select, and a select from final. So now let's do dbt run again. And we would expect it to run all three of these models that we've now built. 1, 2, 3. We can see it recognizes 3 models. And it's running one at a time, because also to point out, that was because we have only one thread. If we had 3 threads, it would run all of those at the same time, but we only kept it as one. Either way, it's only 4 seconds because it's just deploying views, which are pretty quick. Back in Snowflake here, if we refresh, we now see all of them here. This is another reason why I like naming them like this, because it's going to group them. Ultimately, we're going to create a staging schema. So by creating them this way, we can group them together. It's going to keep everything in order. And we can see everything's in here, looking good. And like we said, the last thing here for the staging layer, we want to create a schema.yaml for every directory that we have. So what we want to do here is we'll create a schema.yaml. You could name this whatever you want. The name of this isn't as important. What's important is that it ends with .yaml, and the formatting here. Here, this is going to be very similar to the sources, but again, instead of sources here, we have models, and we'll just give it a name. So let's just take this first part. There's a lot of other things. We can go very specific into every column. We're not going to get into that right now, but in this schema.yaml for Avengers, let's give the names of the models. That's all we have for this. And again, we could add level information. We can add descriptions, and this will come into play later when we get into data documentation and dictionaries and tests. We'll start using this file more, but for now, let's just get them started. And because they're in different directories, we can just call them all the same thing, call them all schema, doesn't matter. So, and this is a list, so we'll break them out with the dashes. And while we're at it, let's just add schemas for each of these. We don't have the names of the models yet, but this is placeholders until we get there. So at this point, we've created our staging models, but in the next video, what we'll do now is we'll push these changes to GitHub and see how that workflow looks for moving these changes along for potentially the rest of our team to see. So I'll see you at the next video.